Welcome to the latest in our series of podcasts exploring the archetypal wisdom that Shakespeare's plays have to offer leaders in the ever-changing modern world. And I'm delighted to introduce today's contributor, Ben Walden. Ben is a founding associate of Olivier Mythodrama, and he's a director of our classic programs, the ones using Shakespeare and other stories. He was an actor for many years and played leading roles in the West End in London and also on television. And he was a member of the inaugural company at Shakespeare's Globe, where he worked with Mark Rylance and Richard Olivier in the early development of Mythodrama. He has spoken on leadership and the arts at conferences around a broad range of organisations and with many leading business schools. And he is also the founder and artistic director of the company Contender Charlie, which explores leadership and communication themes with staff and students in schools around the world. So welcome, Ben.
Nice to be here. Hi, Phyllida.
Really, really pleased to be having this conversation. Julius Caesar, it was very much your baby, I think, when we started working on it in Mythodrama. And I'm sure we'll get into all kinds of details around the themes. But just to start us off, many people have said, including your father, I think, that this is a play that is a brilliant case study of how politics works. Politics with a small p and with a big P. And I know you've spent a lot of your life moving in and out of political circles, so I can see why it's so intriguing to you.
It is very true that my dad was very passionate about this play. My father was a politician and then he became a political interviewer. And when I was still quite young, I think, and was studying to be an actor, he once said to me that if he was going to get anybody to begin to understand the complexities of politics, the first thing he would get them to do is read Shakespeare's play of Julius Caesar. And because he was a professional politician, I wondered if he was just saying it to kind of, metaphorically win my vote. And I said, well, why? It's lovely because I love Shakespeare, but why? And he said, because so many of the great political dilemmas are in that play, and then they're brought to life by these extraordinarily articulate characters. So I've always been very passionate about the play. And then I have another personal reason, which is that it was the very first Shakespeare play I ever read out loud. And we had to read it in class at school when I was about 10 or 11. And I remember I read one of Mark Antony's speeches, and the teacher looked at me and said, "That's very, very good." And I thought, yeah, it was. I found something I'm actually good at. And it was the beginning of what eventually became my being interested in theatre and wanting to be an actor. So the first place I found that was with Mark Antony, I think. So I've always been very fond of Caesar.
Could you talk a little bit then about how that translates into organisational life? Because as I said, it is politics with a little p and a big P.
Yeah.
So what were the kind of tendrils, the themes that first made you think this would be a good programme for Mythodrama?
Well, there are so many with Caesar. I think the first one is possibly to say as an overview that for some people, politics is a kind of inconvenience. It's like that ugly bit we have to do, but if only the world didn't have any politics in it, wouldn't we all be so much better? Which is ironic because the root of the word politics is the word polis, meaning city or state. And as human beings, as if we live as social animals, and we are social animals, most of us, and being on Zoom, we're all missing being able to actually see each other in person and all these things. Then if you live in a polis, you're going to have a politics. So there's no real avoiding it. And also it can be a truly amazing, dynamic force for change politics. It doesn't have to be awful little side deals and vast egos dominating things that they're not fit to lead and all the sort of cliched negatives of politics. It just doesn't have to be that way. So the first thing to say is that politics can be a passion or a vocation. And I think that there is really room for people to be very political and at the same time have a lot of integrity and really be there in service to people they lead, rather than the politics being the Machiavellian manipulations of a dark few who want to control us all. It doesn't have to be that way, but it's more likely to be that way if we step out of the political debate, because then they're going to just gleefully have it all to themselves. So that was the first thing that came up for me. But the other thing is that there are huge themes around dictator versus republic, which, sitting in a meeting, we might think, well, that's got nothing to do with me, but it has. There are moments when a senior leader will think, oh, I wish I just, why do I have to consult any of these people? I know what I want to do. I've known for a month what I want to do. I'm hearing another opinion that's ill-informed. We should just run things the way that we know right around here. And then other times when, of course, the group field is far more intelligent than the individual, and someone will have an idea that you think, wow, I would never have thought of that. Isn't it great to consult and use the group's expertise? And getting that balance right, I think, is also very important, because the major underlying theme in the play is oligarchy versus democracy, and the great dangers and the great strengths of both. And that's a very difficult conversation, but nevertheless remains always, I think, for us, a vital one, especially in times of crisis as well.
That's so interesting, isn't it? It's a balance. I mean, it's a much over-quoted quotation from, I think, Churchill, who said that, does he say democracy is the worst political system except for all the others?
That's it. Yeah, until you've had a look at all the others or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and the idea that that, as we've been discovering in the last few years, seems to be more so in the world generally, but that it's not, that there will never be a time when we have a perfect system by which decisions will get perfectly made. So it's sort of work in progress. And there's a feeling in this play, isn't there, that it's a bit stuck. There's a storm very early on, which in Shakespeare is usually symptomatic of something, something is rotten in the state of Rome, and the system needs to be shaken up a bit. And as you know, in our archetypal model, there is this idea of the renegade, the transformer energy, the leadership of change. And how can that work within a system that's become a bit calcified?
Yeah. Well, one of the problems with the Roman system at the time of the play is that all roads lead to Caesar. He has such centralized control. I sometimes say on the courses as a joke, but Caesar's the kind of guy who, if you're writing an email with some nice ideas in it, he'll want to be copied in on it. And if the ideas are really good ones, you'll find they end up being his ideas, and you're credited on page 17 of his notes. So because all roads led to him, or all the crucial decisions lead to him, it gets very restrictive and it gets very limited in its scope, because it's the Caesarian response to everything, really. But I wonder, I mean, let me ask you something. You've directed, you've run endless programs around Caesar with us. And what do you think that Brutus is unrealistic in his sense that Rome could be a sort of perfect democracy if only it was allowed to be? Do you think he goes too far?
Well, it's tricky, isn't it? So with this play, more than any of the others, I find myself drifting away from the play and engaging in kind of wishful thinking, which is dangerous because it's not in the play. But my beef with Brutus really in the play is twofold. The first, when he speaks to the people, he speaks to them in prose, which is not how he speaks in the rest of the play. So that says to me there's something around that means he's not very comfortable. He's not really in his element, and he falls back on the rules of rhetoric, and he's talking about important things. He's talking about fundamental civic pride and freedom and the future, big picture stuff, but it just doesn't quite land. It doesn't go across from human to human, and that's very interesting. And Antony, of course, then comes on and just does it brilliantly. And the other thing about Brutus, and again, it's not in the play, but he never shows any willingness to step into the void. He never shows any willingness to even be a caretaker leader of any kind. There's no plan, is there, for when they've got rid of Caesar? I mean, this is a play in which short-term planning work is brilliantly successful, but the long-term planning is unsuccessful because there isn't any. So that's my problem with him. I think he's an idealist, and he's bound to fail because he's not engaged. And he says, doesn't he, later in the play, I can't have anything to do with money that's been raised by vile means, seeming to imply that I can't have anything to do with the filthy business of politics.
That's it.
And he leaves it all up to Cassius, and that's a mistake.
That's it. I have to say I completely agree with that. I also think that is a key theme for us, is that Brutus has so many potential leadership qualities in any woman or man. He has a real sense of integrity and service. He really cares about the people of Rome, or at least he claims he does. I think on the whole, he from his very senior position, I think he has genuine concern. And he really believes in the democratic system. But what is, I think, one of the big themes that's very relevant for our times, for organizational life and for political life, is that that's all great, but Antony's a much better communicator. And, and we often go, yes, but, you have these people who communicate very skillfully, but often their arguments are very base, and they're not based in data. And do people really take these people seriously? And the answer is, you bet they do. And unless you can learn to tell compelling narratives the way they do, they will outmaneuver you. And I think Brutus is quite naive about that.
Completely, I mean, he would be hopeless in the face of fake news, wouldn't he? I mean, he wouldn't know what to do with that. And we've seen that in some of our politicians these days. There are people who can put over a simple message very well, even if that simple message isn't altogether truthful. But simplicity, what is it that the rumour will get round the world before the truth's got his trousers on? What is that?
That's it. That's one of the great dangers. And Antony is absolutely superb in that area. And I think that one of the things I found over the years with the program is that people often go, yes, but the thing is that Antony manipulates the crowd. And that's not ethical, is it? And we can't do that. But the root of the word manipulation is manus, hands, in Latin. And an osteopath manipulates the back. We manipulate each other all the time to try and persuade people of why we're right and why we believe what is right should be done and so on. It doesn't necessarily make it disingenuous, fake, or power crazed. And Antony is brilliant at it. And if we sneer at it or sort of are distasteful of it, again, the door's left wide open for those who are good at it to win the argument. So there is a real issue here about the balance between the vital need for service and ethical integrity mixed with terrific communication skills. And
I agree. Yeah, I think that the argument at the heart of the program that we run, and if it doesn't come up in the room, which it usually does, but if it doesn't, I put it in the room, which is this business, you've already mentioned it, around the dark arts and manipulation. That politics is a filthy business and only horrible people do politics. And that is not helpful. And in fact, usually what the conversation ends up being is, what is the difference between manipulation and influencing? And one answer to that question is, it depends on your intention. Right. I mean, I love you talk about manipulating the hands. I was thinking about, we've got kids, somebody tugging at your sleeve, that's manipulation. And that's what influencing is. I'm trying to bring you from where you are to where I want you to be. And if I'm very skillful, I will do that in a way that ties in with what you want, so that it's a win-win.
Absolutely. I mean, there's politics even within the household. Especially at the moment with everyone, caught at home and, and having to spend a lot of time with family. Don't tell me there isn't, family politics and deals and manipulations. And look, if you do this, I'll do this. And I promise that. And, and kids are magnificent bargain makers. They really belong at senior levels of the civil service when it comes to that particular skill. It's like, okay, I'll do it. But in return, I want this and I want that. And I think this needs to be done like that. And, we do this instinctively. It is part of our social adaptation and skill. So for me, it's much better to get really good at it and to marry that to a sense of what do I serve that is bigger than just my own gain or publicizing, because that is where it goes really wrong.
That's right. So an attachment to a common good or a bigger purpose, or just something that we need to be doing in order to exist. So It's not always about integrity, I think. It's sometimes about what's necessary. And that's when the tricky decisions come in, right? So there will be a lot of people at the moment, many, many leaders around the world, who are having to take really tough decisions to ensure the survival of their companies. And the result of those decisions will be awful for lots of people. And yet it will be about survival. So that, I wonder how we craft this to make it properly useful to those people, and to really encourage leaders to understand the different qualities of influencing, the different sources of influence, the different sources of power. Mm-hmm. And also, I think I'd like to hear you talk a bit more about this business of understanding other people, getting data on what motivates other people so that you can speak to them from that place.
Yeah.
What is it that matters to you that I can speak to?
Well, Antony is, I mean, again, that comes back a little bit to Antony, because Cassius is brilliant at understanding people's political motivations, or where their strategic policy preferences lie. He's really terrific with that. And he'll think, now so-and-so and so-and-so loathe each other, but ironically, they both want the same outcome on this particular issue. They're both very well connected. I need to get them in a meeting. And if I can get them to talk to each other for long enough, we could actually build a very effective coalition here. And he's superb at that. He's a marvelous coalition builder. But when it comes to hearts as well as minds, and embodying what you see in others, or using the language that you think will appeal to them and work to them, that's where Antony is outstandingly good. And it is almost like a kind of master actor in a way, Antony, in the sense that if he feels that someone is very strategic, he could be extremely strategic with them. If he feels that someone is very values driven, he's all values. If he feels that someone is all about the, exploration of our future potential, it's all the vision of what we might be. He can move around that with incredible skills. So in terms of the many archetypal qualities, he seems to have an ability to embody almost any of them. And that's an amazing strength. But for me in the play, it's very dangerous because he uses them very unethically. And the combination of that level of skill balanced with a lack of care for anything other than, my thing. There's an aspect of Antony, I think, that is like an extraordinarily articulate mafia boss. It's like, you hit our guy, now we're going to hit you. And if there's huge collateral damage in Rome and, innocent poets get beaten to death in the street, which is what happens in the scene straight after his most famous speech, well, that's just collateral damage, isn't it, really? We just have to deal with that. So he is really skilled in one area, but how do we marry that with the integrity is the vital part of this that Brutus has far more of. But Antony's ability to look at body language, tone of voice, to see what is moving people, and how they are responding to it is an incredible skill. And it's a bit of a repeating theme of mine, at least in my work, that we don't learn about this enough. And in school, you don't learn about influencing skills. You kind of do. You learn about them unofficially in the playground and in working out which staff members kind of respond to what. But you never quite do in the sense that you could do by actually studying it as a subject. And there are people, not least people like Daniel Goleman, and many others who have suggested that emotional intelligence skills should actually really be a part of curriculum, because there is so much that we learn about life and our own well-being through them.
That's so interesting. And it reminds me, I think you said, because you've been in a production of this, haven't you, at the Globe?
Yeah.
And there's a scene, isn't there, just after the assassination, when Antony comes in and finds the conspirators all standing there with their hands covered in blood. And he shakes hands with them. And nothing else is really going on, is it? And I remember you talking about that. You're thinking, why does he do that? What is he doing?
We wondered that a lot when we did the production, because I met other people who've done Caesar, I'm sure will find the same thing, that once he goes round and shakes the hands, that's quite a big chunk of stage time. And you find yourself going, wow, are we just going to do this in silence? Because if we do, that's going to be a bit of a statement. Or are we going to cover it with the verse that goes over it? And we found that if you do it as an actual section on its own, it suddenly takes on a big focused significance. And for me, there's an aspect in which, and obviously I'm being a bit glib because it's 400 years ago, or nearly 400 years ago, but there's an aspect in which he's like a wonderful NLP practitioner. He's going round and he reads their feeling states through tone of voice, body language, eye contact, all that stuff. Now, obviously, Mark Antony never went on a course. That's not his thing. But he has an amazing ability to read into people. The other thing that he does in that particular scene is that I don't think I've ever found a production or heard of a production where there isn't a debate about, does he really mean all this, or is he faking it? And no one ever can quite agree. The textual evidence suggests it could be either way. But my suspicion has always been he really means it. But then Antony could mean kind of whatever he needed to mean in the moment. And He loves Caesar clearly and cared about him, and is very, very, very upset about his death. The great "Oh, pardon me, thou bleeding piece of earth" speech is all about how he's going to revenge that. But he has an ability to, as it were, kind of ride the tiger. He can feel something very strongly emotionally and then move with it and make it tremendously articulate and impassioned and draw people in. That's an extraordinary skill in influence. And we can learn more about that through the combination of being very emotionally open, but also very grounded, so that Antony is able to really work on two different levels, or multiple levels even at the same time. What do I need to do here? What do I need to do now? But he has access to that emotion. And how many debates do you watch, or how many politicians do you see, and you look and you think, this is great, but there's something about you just doesn't strike our heart. You know, we want a Lincoln or a Mandela, and, you know, where are you? And Antony has that gift. And the problem is he uses it to bad ends.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? I've been watching during the lockdown, the politicians have been doing these daily briefings. And unusual, because the whole thing is unusual. And they stand there at lecterns and they read something out, and it really, because it's only just been written, you know, they can't be expected to have learned it or to speak off the cuff. I completely get that, but I'm really feeling that, because not only is there's no kind of, or there's not much sense of spontaneity around it, but also they're communicating through a whole series of screens, and that ability for human contact. And this fascinates me because we are, by and large, I think people are mistrustful of charismatic leaders, and with good reason, because often in the past people have been swayed, bowled over, fallen in love with people who've then done them harm. And yet, as you say, you know, the storytelling quality is such a wonderful lubricant for getting people thinking and feeling differently. So how can we help leaders get past that suspicion, especially now there's so much talk about vulnerability in leaders? You know, how do we balance that sense of, I'm a human being, I have feelings, with, I have something that I need to communicate to you, and it's very important that you listen to me?
The poet David White talks about what he calls robust vulnerability. And that's a wonderful skill in this area, the ability to take a stand in the political arena, what we might call the sovereign skills. You know, I will be seen and heard. I'm not nervous of people disapproving of me. I'll make eye contact. I am worth standing up and being counted. That's a vital skill for people. You know, that part of us that goes, oh, who am I to make a difference? Who am I to be heard? That can kick you right out of the political debate straight away, and the organizational debate straight away. And yet we are working with hierarchies. We are working with different forms of power that can outmaneuver us against what we believe is right and should be done. So we need the ability to stand and really not be nervous of being in the spotlight. But we also need the ability to see how different people are motivated in different ways, and to keep reminding ourselves of what we are here to serve, that is bigger than ourselves and is what people asked for, or say they want and need, rather than what we've decided they ought to have, in a way that they're giving you very clear feedback they don't want and it isn't working. So the balance of all those things brings us into the realm of a marvelous political influencer. And that's something we found over the years, is that with Caesar's tremendous confidence, which goes too far, it becomes overbearing. I mean, he refers to himself in the third person. I do recommend business leaders don't do that. You know, if I stand here going, Walden has decided we will not have next week's board meeting, you know, it's time that the board acted to remove me. And so you have Caesar's tremendous confidence, Cassius's brilliant skills of seeing how networks are operating and where key gatekeepers lie, Brutus's integrity, and then Antony's skill with people and with winning hearts as well as minds. Combine the four of them, you've potentially got a terrific leader, with one exception: it's 4 men, and we need some women in leadership. So
they can do those skills as well.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. Hearing you talk, it just occurred to me, it hasn't really occurred to me before, that there isn't much long-term thinking in that quartet, is there? Brutus possibly, arguably, is looking to the future of a state that celebrates itself and people are happy to be citizens, but everyone else is working in the short term, aren't they? And that is the truth about politics. You know, most democratic systems, if you have an election every 4 years, it's very hard. I used to work in a scenario planning department in a government department, and trying to get policymakers to plan for the future beyond the next 4 years is tricky, understandably tricky, because A, they're busy, and B, their political life may only last for 4 years. So it's, you know, the idea that we have to build in long-term thinking, especially now when we are right in the middle of really properly understanding what it is to not know what the future holds. So how can we, and it's great what you say about the sovereign, so that bit of leadership that not only, as you said, is prepared to take up time and space and be heard and claim the right and claim a voice to be listened to, but also to project something into the future that will inspire people to want to go on a journey.
Absolutely.
That's missing in this play, I think.
It is. And it's, I mean, you could argue Caesar has a vision for Rome, but that vision for Rome is very Caesarian. Really, it's sort of, let Caesar decide everything and you'll find things work wonderfully well. It's much more dictatorship, and he's already made himself dictator for life, so the Caesarian vision is very about Caesar. It's the Caesar show. So that's not so helpful for us. And then beyond that, the other three really struggle with that. They do struggle with long-term thinking. And in our world, this is a great climate change problem. How do we legislate for something that is a very slow burning, enormous problem, which we're seeing more and more manifestations of now, but nevertheless, won't necessarily win you the next general election. So you're left with a real struggle over that. And it is very difficult, certainly in organizational life, as well as in national political life, to strike the balance between hitting the targets and a real sustainable vision that can inspire people for a greater future. And I get more and more of a sense, and I don't think that this virus will do anything other than accelerate this, that people are looking for an inspirational vision of the future, as well as for making sure we hit vital strategic targets. Yeah. And how can that inspirational vision be shared, calm, blended, and in service, rather than the great dialogue from the leader? The woman or the man who is the sole visionary radiating purpose, because that feels very outmoded, really.
So interesting, isn't it? And it's also that business about legacy. I can think of very many world leaders who, once they're out of power, are very resentful of the fact that people criticize what they did. I can think of one in particular, but I won't name him. But the idea that anyone's going to thank you for what you've done is a real mistake in leadership. Antony says about Caesar, he says, the evil that men do lives after them. The good is often interred with the bones, and there's something about if you do your planning, expecting it to have your name on at the end. I know in the States there's a great tradition, isn't there, of libraries and university buildings named after airports, named after presidents, and they get their legacy. But if that's why you're doing it, even a little bit, that's gonna be hard, and you will likely fall on your face, and you will get things wrong, and people will criticize you for them.
And that's something I think is a tremendous challenge. That's like a very advanced challenge that the play brings. I once heard a very distinguished Jungian psychologist say that they'd worked with many very senior leaders and found that the most crucial difference of all was between those who still deep down felt it was all about them and those who'd got beyond that, often in the face of a major crisis, which kind of transformed them in a way that they'd never have signed up for, but really gave them that humility they didn't have before, that they are really just a very small moment in a much, much greater picture. To be able to achieve that is something none of our characters in the play are able to achieve, and it is a major question for leadership in our times, I think. The thing in me that I find very interesting in this is that a lot of people will look at plays like, say, The Tempest or Hamlet or many of the other plays that we work with and go, these plays have such tremendous spiritual and ethical themes, and Caesar's such a dirty little play about politics. And for me, Caesar is one of the most passionate and important of all the plays, because it's about the world we actually live in and trying to change things now rather than dreaming of a future, when it's right now that we also need to be focused on and dealing with the dynamics we're in rather than the dynamics we think we ought to be in. You go to that too quickly, and I think that's really naive.
Oh, that's such a great way of putting it. I love that. We're nearly out of time, but there's one little bit in the play I'd like to just discuss very briefly, because we focus on it in the programme, which is the scene when Decius goes to see Caesar in his palace and tries to persuade him to go to the Senate, because he's a very little man in the hierarchy, and yet he changes the most powerful man in the Western world. Could you talk a little bit about that scene, about the sources of power, really?
I remember, one of the things I remember about that scene is I played Decius at the Globe, because in the Globe companies, I think it was in '99, it was the 400th anniversary, and the 400th anniversary, and that part was one of several that I played where there was a lot of interaction with Caesar. And Caesar was up on a balcony, and he literally had the positional power. I mean, he had the whole globe, and Decius turned with his back and to the audience, and was, because you don't turn your back on Caesar, and was trying to make sure that, you know, he could get the point across. And what was wonderful about that is, first of all, it was a masterclass, that particular scene, and I believe is a masterclass in how you influence a narcissist. You know, and I'm sure there are a few people who watch this will go, ooh, I'll have a look at that then, because I work for one, you know. How you influence a narcissist is a very important part of that. And also Decius's ability to press all Caesar's buttons around the things that interest Caesar privately and personally, about his own advancement, his own position in the Senate. And Decius presses every single one of them, while at the same time, you know, portraying the whole thing as if these are just afterthoughts that Caesar's bound to have thought of already himself, you know. And he brings Caesar down, and it's actually a totally critical moment in the play. If Caesar follows Calpurnia's advice in the story, and he'd be wise to follow her advice, but he doesn't bother, then the whole thing would change, because the next day he's supposed to go off and be under the protection of the army and so on and so forth on a new campaign. So Decius has an absolutely central moment there in which he swings world history in what at the moment looks like just a little passing in a corridor. And the stakes being so high in such a subtle, you know, negotiation is, I think, very politically accurate.
It's great, isn't it? And the idea that you can borrow power. It's not necessarily invested in you from the start. And if we're trying to get stuff done, there are lots of different ways in which we can achieve power and influence in order to get the right things done. Ben, we're out of time. That was such a great conversation. I think we should probably do another one.
I loved it. We
just scratched the surface, but
I hope people will enjoy it. It is a play that has the most marvelous political resonances. You know, I won't forget. I lost my old man last year, and he did love that play so dearly, and I trust that a lot because he was very passionate about his politics.
Great, thank you, Ben.
Not at all. Thank you.